The bank manager arrived on Thursday morning. Robert's son met him in the lobby, confused, sweating through his pressed shirt. By Friday afternoon, the account was frozen. By Monday, the police were involved, but it started with 7 words Robert wasn't supposed to hear. The old man doesn't even know what day it is anymore. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like the video for your support. Thank you for subscribing. Robert Chen had been in room 14 at Veterans Hope Residence for 2 years and 4 months. Not that anyone asked, not that anyone seemed to remember he could still count. The room faced west, which meant late afternoon sun that turned everything amber and made him squint when he sat in his chair by the window. The light reminded him of Korea, of dusty hills and the way sunset looked through rifle smoke, though he tried not to think about that too often. He was 81 years old, though his driver's license still said 80 because he hadn't renewed it since they took away his car. His hair had gone white years ago, but he kept it military short, the way he'd worn it since 1950. Every morning at 6:15, he shaved with the same methodical strokes he'd learned in basic training: left cheek, right cheek, chin, upper lip, neck. The routine mattered. It reminded him he was still Robert Chen, not just the man in room 14. The facility was newer than most, built maybe 10 years ago with that corporate efficiency that made everything look clean, but nothing look lived in. Beige walls, gray carpeting, motivational posters in the hallways about journey and gratitude and making every day count. Robert had made plenty of days count. He'd served 2 tours in Korea, worked 34 years for the Postal Service, raised 3 kids, buried a wife. He didn't need a poster to tell him about counting days. His room was small but functional, a bed with rails he never used, a dresser with 5 drawers, though he only needed 3, a closet that held 4 button-up shirts, 2 pairs of slacks, 1 cardigan, and his dress uniform in a garment bag he hadn't opened in 3 years. On the dresser sat a framed photo of Margaret, his wife, taken in 1978 at their daughter Linda's college graduation. Margaret had been gone 8 years now. Heart attack, sudden. The kind that doesn't give you time to say the things you should have said decades earlier. The daily routine at Veterans Hope was predictable, which Robert appreciated. Breakfast came at 7:30, always oatmeal or scrambled eggs that tasted like they'd been cooked in a factory and reheated on site. Lunch at noon, usually something with gravy. Dinner at 5:30, early enough that he was hungry again by 9, but had learned to live with it. Between meals, there were activities. Bingo on Mondays, a discussion group on Wednesdays that mostly involved people complaining about their ailments. Movie afternoons on Fridays, though the films were always 20 years old and the volume too loud. Robert had 3 children. Linda, the oldest, lived in Seattle with her husband and worked in hospital administration. She called every few months, usually on Sundays, conversations that lasted exactly 12 minutes and covered weather, grandchildren, and whether Robert needed anything. He always said no. David, the middle child, lived in Boston and sent cards on holidays with generic messages printed inside and his signature at the bottom. And then there was James. James lived 20 minutes away. He visited every week, sometimes twice. He brought groceries Robert didn't need, since the facility provided meals. He brought newspapers Robert couldn't read anymore without his reading glasses, which he kept losing. He brought concern and attention and an earnestness that made Robert uncomfortable because it felt like something was being performed rather than felt. But James was there, and that counted for something. That had always counted for something. It was a Tuesday afternoon, early October, when Robert heard it. The air conditioning hummed through the vent above his bed, and outside his window, a maintenance worker was trimming hedges with electric shears that buzzed like angry wasps. Robert was sitting in his chair, the one with the worn armrests that fit his hands perfectly, staring at the television without really watching it. Some cooking show. A woman making something with phyllo dough and spinach. James had visited that morning. He'd brought apples, 3 of them, red and shiny, and placed them in the bowl on Robert's dresser like an offering. They'd talked about the weather, about Linda's daughter starting high school, about how the facility was thinking of repainting the common room. Normal things, safe things. Then James had excused himself to take a phone call, stepping into the hallway and pulling the door most of the way closed, but not quite latched. Robert hadn't meant to listen, but voices carry in hallways, especially when someone thinks they have privacy. James was talking to someone, his voice low but not low enough. "Yeah, I'm here now," James said. There was a pause. No, he's fine, same as always. Another pause. Robert muted the television. Listen, about the account, James continued. His voice dropped lower, but Robert's hearing was better than people assumed. I transferred another $2,000 yesterday. He hasn't said anything. Robert's hand tightened on the armrest. Come on, don't worry about it, James said. And there was something in his tone, something impatient and dismissive. The old man doesn't even know what day it is anymore. He'll never notice the account's empty. The words hung in the air like smoke. Robert didn't move. He stared at the television, at the woman folding phyllo dough with careful precision, and felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger, not yet. Clarity. The sharp, cutting kind that comes when the world suddenly makes sense in a way you wish it didn't. James came back into the room a moment later, all smiles. Sorry about that, Dad. Work stuff. Robert nodded. He didn't trust his voice yet. You need anything before I go? James asked, already reaching for his jacket. No, Robert said. His voice came out steady, normal. I'm good. All right, I'll see you Thursday, okay? Thursday, Robert repeated. After James left, Robert sat very still. Outside, the maintenance worker had moved on, and the only sound was the muted hum of the air conditioning. The cooking show had ended, replaced by a game show with too much color and noise. Robert turned it off. He thought about the account James had mentioned, his military pension account. It had been set up decades ago, automatic deposits twice a month, a modest amount that had accumulated over years of careful non-spending. When Margaret died, Robert had added James as a joint account holder, just in case, the bank manager had said, in case something happens and bills need to be paid. It made sense at the time. James was responsible, James was local, James could be trusted. Robert stood slowly, his knees protesting, and walked to the small desk in the corner of his room. It was mostly for show, a piece of furniture the facility provided to make the rooms look less institutional. In the single drawer, Robert kept a few things: old birthday cards, a pocket watch that didn't work, his reading glasses, and underneath it all, a business card. The card was old, its edges soft from handling. Richard Masterson, branch manager, First National Bank. Richard had been the one to help Robert set up the account after he retired from the post office. They'd known each other slightly, both members of the local VFW post, both men who understood that handshakes still meant something. Robert had no idea if Richard still worked at the bank. The card was at least 15 years old, but he tucked it into his shirt pocket and sat back down in his chair by the window. The light was starting to fade outside, that amber glow turning deeper, more orange. A woman walked past on the sidewalk below, pulling a small dog on a leash. The dog stopped to sniff every third step, and the woman waited patiently, scrolling on her phone. Normal life. People moving through their days, unaware that in a room above them, an old man was realizing his son was a thief. Robert didn't sleep much that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the facility at night. Someone coughing 3 rooms down. The soft squeak of a medication cart being pushed past his door. The low murmur of night shift nurses talking at the station down the hall. He thought about Korea, about the cold, about the men he'd served with, some of whom made it home and some of whom didn't. He thought about Margaret, about the way she used to organize their checkbook with entries in perfect handwriting, balancing it to the penny every month. And he thought about James, about the times James had asked to borrow. Money over the years, small amounts at first, $500 for car repairs, $1,000 for a security deposit on an apartment. Robert had always said yes. He'd said yes because that's what fathers did, because Margaret had believed in helping your children when they needed it, because he'd wanted to believe James would pay it back, even though he never did. But this wasn't borrowing. This was stealing. There was a difference. The next morning, Robert woke at 5:45, earlier than usual. He shaved carefully, dressed in his good slacks and a button-up shirt, and pinned his Korean War veteran pin to his collar. He combed his hair. He looked at himself in the small bathroom mirror and saw a man who'd been underestimated. It wasn't the first time, probably wouldn't be the last. But today, he was going to do something about it. At 7:15, before breakfast trays arrived, Robert walked to the front desk. The receptionist was a young woman named Ashley, who always spoke to him like he was hard of hearing, which he wasn't, or simple, which he definitely wasn't. "Good morning, Mr. Chen," she said too loudly. "You're up early." "I need to make a phone call," Robert said. "A private one." Ashley blinked. "Oh, you can use the phone in your room." "I'd prefer to use the office phone," Robert said, "if it's available." There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of confusion. Then Ashley nodded and gestured to a small room behind the desk. "Sure, I'll give you some privacy." The office was cramped, filled with filing cabinets and a desk covered in papers. There was a landline phone, the old kind with a coiled cord. Robert sat down in the office chair, pulled out Richard Masterson's business card, and dialed. The phone rang 4 times. Then a woman's voice answered. "First National Bank, how may I direct your call?" "Richard Masterson, please," Robert said. "Branch manager." "One moment." There was a click, then hold music, some soft jazz that reminded Robert of waiting rooms and elevator rides. He gripped the phone tighter. "This is Richard Masterson." The voice was older, rougher, but Robert recognized it. "Richard, this is Robert Chen." There was a pause. "Robert, my God, Robert Chen? How long has it been?" "Too long," Robert said. "I need your help." They talked for 20 minutes. Robert explained the situation calmly, methodically, the way he'd been trained to report during his military service. Dates, amounts, what he'd overheard. Richard listened without interrupting, and when Robert finished, there was a long silence. "Robert," Richard said finally, his voice heavy. "I'm so sorry. I'll need to pull the account records. Can you come in?" "I can be there by 10, Robert said. "I'll be waiting." Robert hung up and sat in the office for a moment, hands folded on the desk. Through the door, he could hear Ashley answering phones, the cheerful tone she used with families calling to check on their relatives. Outside the warm window, morning sun filtered through thin blinds, casting stripes across the wall. He stood, straightened his shirt, and walked back to his room. Breakfast was waiting on his tray. Oatmeal, toast, orange juice. He ate slowly, every bite deliberate. He'd need his strength for what came next. At 9:30, Robert told the front desk he was going for a walk. They didn't question it. Residents were allowed to leave as long as they signed out, and Robert still had that privilege. He signed his name in the logbook, noted the time, and walked out the front door into air that smelled like cut grass and car exhaust. The bank was 1.5 miles away. Robert knew because he'd walked it dozens of times back when he still lived in his own house, back when walking to the bank to deposit his pension check was part of his routine. His legs weren't what they used to be. His hip ached after the first quarter mile, and by the time he reached Main Street, he was breathing harder than he liked. But he kept walking. First National Bank was in a brick building that had been there since the 50s. Robert remembered when it was built, back when this part of town was new and growing. Now it sat between a coffee shop and a dry cleaner, unremarkable except for the brass plaque by the door that listed founding members. Robert's father's name was on that plaque. Samuel Chen, one of the first Chinese-American business owners in the county, a man who'd worked 16-hour days running a laundry service so his son could have a different life. Robert pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped into air conditioning and the faint smell of paper and furniture polish. The lobby was smaller than he remembered, or maybe he'd just gotten used to big spaces feeling larger when you spent most of your time in a 12-by-14 room. Richard Masterson was waiting by the front desk. He'd aged, his hair completely white now, glasses thicker, but he moved with the same no-nonsense efficiency Robert remembered. When he saw Robert, he smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Robert," Richard said, extending his hand. "Good to see you, though I wish it were under better circumstances." They shook hands. Richard's grip was still firm. "Come with me," Richard said. They walked past the teller stations, through a door marked Private, and into a small office with wood paneling and a desk covered in neat stacks of paper. Richard gestured to a chair, and Robert sat down carefully, his hip grateful for the rest. Richard sat across from him and opened a folder. "I pulled your account records this morning. Robert, I have to tell you, this is worse than I thought." He turned the folder around so Robert could see. Pages of statements, rows of numbers. Robert's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his reading glasses, the ones he'd remembered to bring. The account had been opened in 1989, with an initial balance of $1,200. Over the years, deposits had accumulated. His pension, direct deposited twice a month. Interest, small but steady. By 2018, when Margaret died and Robert moved into Veterans Hope, the account had $63,000. Now it had $472. Robert stared at the number. $472 from $63,000. When did it start? Robert asked, his voice quiet. Richard flipped through the pages. Looks like about 6 months after you moved into the facility. Small amounts at first, 500 here, 800 there. Then it escalated. In the past year, there have been withdrawals of $2,000 to $3,000 every few weeks. How? Robert asked. I never authorized this. Richard's jaw tightened. Your son is listed as a joint account holder. That gives him full access. Technically, he doesn't need your permission. But he told me he was just on there for emergencies. I know, Richard said, and I'm sorry. We should have flagged this. Large, frequent withdrawals from a senior account, especially one belonging to a veteran. We should have noticed. Robert sat back in his chair. The office felt smaller suddenly, the walls closer. His son had stolen from him, not borrowed, not mismanaged. Stolen, systematically, over 2 years, draining his life savings while visiting him every week with apples and small talk. What can I do? Robert asked. Richard leaned forward. First, we freeze the account immediately. I'll remove James as a joint holder. Then we contact the authorities. This is elder financial abuse, Robert. It's a crime. He's my son, Robert said, though he wasn't sure why that mattered anymore. I know, Richard said gently, but he stole from you, and if we don't report it, he'll do it to someone else. Robert looked at the statements again. $63,000, Margaret's life insurance, his pension, the money he'd saved to leave to his children, to help Linda with her mortgage, to help David with his student loans, to help James with whatever he needed because that's what fathers did. Do it, Robert said. Freeze it, report it, all of it. Richard nodded. He picked up the phone and dialed. I'm calling the fraud department now. And Robert, I'm also calling someone I know in the county prosecutor's office. They handle elder abuse cases. The next hour passed in a blur of phone calls and paperwork. Robert sat in Richard's office, signing forms, answering questions, providing dates and details. A woman from the prosecutor's office arrived, mid-40s, professional, with kind eyes that had probably seen this too many times. Her name was Janet Reese, and she asked Robert to tell her everything. He did. He told her about James's visits, about the overheard phone call, about the account. She took notes, nodding occasionally, and when he finished, she set down her pen and looked at him with something that might have been sadness or might have been anger. Mr. Chen, she said, what your son did is a felony. We're going to investigate, and if the evidence supports what you've told me, we'll file charges. I want you to understand what that means. This will likely go to court. Your son could face prison time. I understand, Robert said, and your family might not forgive you for this. Robert thought about that, about Linda, who would be shocked, about David, who would be distant and uncomfortable, about James, who would probably deny everything, who would call him senile and confused, who would try to turn this around. I don't need forgiveness, Robert said. I need my dignity back. Janet Reese smiled slightly. Then, we'll get it for you. By the time Robert left the bank, it was almost 1 p.m. His hip ached, his legs felt like rubber, and he was hungry in a way that made his hands shake. But he'd done it. The account was frozen. James's access was revoked. The authorities were involved. He stopped at a diner on the way back, a little place called Rosie's that had been there forever. He ordered a turkey sandwich and coffee, sat in a booth by the window, and watched people pass on the sidewalk outside. Normal people. People whose children probably didn't steal from them. Or maybe they did. Maybe this was more common than anyone wanted to admit. The sandwich was good. The coffee was better. By the time Robert paid and left, he felt steadier. When he walked back into Veterans Hope at 2:15, Ashley at the front desk looked up and smiled. Oh, good, Mr. Chen. You had a visitor. Your son James stopped by. Robert's stomach tightened. When? About noon. He seemed upset you weren't here. He said he'd try to call you later. Thank you, Robert said. In his room, the message light on his phone was blinking. 3 messages? Robert didn't listen to them. Instead, he sat in his chair by the window and waited. James called at 3:30. Robert answered on the second ring. Dad? James's voice was tight, strained. Where were you today? I went for a walk, Robert said calmly. A walk for 4 hours? I stopped for lunch. There was a pause. Dad, I got a really weird call from the bank. They said my account access was suspended. Do you know anything about that? It's not your account, Robert said. It's mine. Well, yeah, but I'm listed as joint, remember? For emergencies? There's no emergency, Robert said. So I removed you. Another pause, longer. You removed me? That's right. Dad, I don't understand. Did someone tell you to do this? One of the staff? Because sometimes people at these facilities, they try to take advantage. No one took advantage of me, Robert interrupted. His voice was steady, cold. But someone did steal from me. Silence. Dad, what are you talking about? I'm talking about $63,000, James. I'm talking about 2 years of withdrawals. I'm talking about you draining my account while telling me everything was fine. Dad, you're confused. I heard you, Robert said. On Tuesday, in the hallway, you were on the phone. You said, the old man doesn't even know what day it is anymore. The silence on the other end was different now, heavier. You called me senile, Robert continued. You thought I wouldn't notice, but I noticed, James, and now the police are noticing too. The police? James's voice cracked. Dad, you called the police on me, your own son? You stole from me, Robert said simply. What did you expect? I didn't steal, I borrowed. I was going to pay it back. With what? I've been having some financial trouble, okay? Business hasn't been great, and I needed help, and I knew you had money just sitting there. It wasn't just sitting there, Robert said, his voice rising for the first time. It was my life savings. It was Margaret's life insurance. It was supposed to be for my care, for my future, for emergencies that were actually emergencies. Dad, please, if you press charges, I'll lose everything. My job, my reputation. You should have thought about that before you stole from your father. I'm sorry, James said, and now he was crying. I'm so sorry. Please don't do this. I'll pay it back, I swear. How? Robert asked. You just said you're broke. James didn't answer. Goodbye, James, Robert said, and he hung up. The phone rang again immediately. Robert unplugged it from the wall. That evening, Robert sat in the common room during dinner service. He'd never eaten there before, preferring to take his meals in his room, but tonight he wanted to be around people. He sat at a table with 3 other veterans, men he'd seen but never really talked to. They introduced themselves: Harold, Army, Vietnam; Dennis, Navy, Gulf War; Frank, Marines, Korea, like Robert. They talked about nothing important: the food, which was bland; the weather, which was getting colder; a football game someone had watched. But there was something comforting about it, about sitting with men who'd served, who understood a certain kind of silence. After dinner, Frank walked with Robert back toward the East Wing. You doing okay? Frank asked. You seem off today. Family trouble, Robert said. Frank nodded. Always is, isn't it? When Robert got back to his room, there was a note taped to his door, handwritten, from the front desk. Linda called. Please call her back. Robert crumpled the note and threw it in the trash. He wasn't ready to talk to Linda yet. She'd want explanations. She'd want to know why he hadn't called her first. She'd probably try to fix it, to smooth things over, because that's what Linda did. She managed problems. But this wasn't a problem to be managed. This was a crime, and Robert had already set the wheels in motion. Over the next few days, things moved quickly. Janet Reese called to update him. They'd interviewed James, who'd admitted to the withdrawals, but claimed they were loans. The bank statements told a different story. $62,000 over 2 years, with no loan agreements, no repayment schedule, nothing in writing, just systematic theft. Linda called again. Robert answered this time. Dad, what is going on? She said without preamble. James called me crying, saying you accused him of stealing, that the police are involved. He did steal, Robert said. $62,000 from my pension account. Dad, that's impossible. James wouldn't do that. He did, Linda. I have the bank statements. But why didn't you call me? We could have worked this out as a family. It's beyond that now, Robert said. Dad, he's your son, my brother. We can't just throw him to the police over money. It's not about the money, Robert said, though it partly was. It's about him thinking I was too senile to notice, too far gone to matter. Linda was quiet for a moment. He said that? He did. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Robert said gently. I just need you to understand why I'm doing this. I'm trying, Linda said. But it's hard, Dad. This is going to tear the family apart. It was already torn, Robert said. I'm just making it official. They talked a little longer, but the conversation was strained, painful. By the time they hung up, Robert knew things with Linda would never be quite the same. She'd always see him differently now, not as the quiet father who went along with things, but as the man who'd turned in his own son. David called too, eventually. He was brief, uncomfortable. I don't know what to say, Dad. This is a mess. It is, Robert agreed. I hope you know what you're doing. So do I, Robert said. The investigation took 3 weeks. In that time, James didn't visit. Neither did Linda. David sent a card, something generic about thinking of him. The apples James had brought the Tuesday rotted in the bowl on the dresser until a nurse threw them away. But other things happened too. Richard Masterson visited, bringing Robert a cashier's check for the $472 remaining in the account, along with a handwritten apology from the bank's CEO for not catching the fraud sooner. The local VFW post commander stopped by, having heard through the veteran grapevine what happened. He brought Robert a new cap and said, "We take care of our own. If you need anything, you call me." And people at the facility started treating him differently. Not with pity, but with a kind of respect he hadn't felt in a long time. The nurses called him Mr. Chen instead of Robert. Staff stopped talking around him like he wasn't there. Even Ashley at the front desk no longer spoke to him like he was hard of hearing. In late November, Janet Reese called with news. "Mr. Chen, we filed charges. 2 counts of felony financial exploitation of an elderly person. Given the amount involved and the sustained nature of the theft, the prosecutor is asking for restitution and jail time." "How much time?" Robert asked. 2 to 5 years. Potentially? Robert sat with that number. 2 to 5 years. His son. In prison. Because of him. "Mr. Chen, you should know James's attorney is trying to negotiate a plea deal. Restitution, probation, no jail time. They're arguing it was a family matter, that you're being vindictive." "What do you think?" Robert asked. "I think he stole $62,000 from a veteran while pretending to care for him. I think he deserves whatever the court decides." "Then I'll leave it to the court," Robert said. The plea hearing was scheduled for December 15th. Robert was asked if he wanted to attend. He said yes. The courthouse was downtown, a limestone building with wide steps and tall columns. Robert took a cab, arriving early, and sat on a bench in the hallway outside the courtroom. He wore his good slacks, a pressed shirt, and his Korean War veteran pin. His hands shook slightly, but he folded them in his lap and waited. Linda arrived 10 minutes before the hearing. She sat down next to him without speaking at first. Then she said, "I talked to James's lawyer. They're offering full restitution over 10 years, 5 years probation, no jail time." "I know," Robert said. "Are you going to accept it?" "It's not up to me," Robert said. "It's up to the judge. But you could ask for leniency. You're the victim. They'd listen to you." Robert turned to look at his daughter. She looked older than he remembered, or maybe he just hadn't really looked at her in a while. "Linda, I spent 2 years in Korea. I saw things no one should see. I came home, worked for 34 years, saved every penny I could, and I did it so my family would be taken care of. Your brother stole that from me, not because he needed it, because he thought I wouldn't notice." "He made a mistake," Linda said. "He made a choice," Robert corrected. "And now he gets to live with the consequences." Linda looked away. "I used to think you were this quiet, gentle man. I didn't know you could be so hard." "I learned to be hard in 1950, Robert said. "I just forgot for a while." The courtroom was smaller than he expected, wood-paneled and formal. Robert sat in the gallery, 2 rows behind where James would sit. Linda sat next to him, but there was space between them, a gap that felt wider than physics allowed. When James entered with his attorney, he looked thinner, older. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge Robert's presence. Maybe that was easier for both of them. The judge was a woman in her 60s, gray-haired and no nonsense. She reviewed the case quickly, asked James's attorney about the plea agreement, then looked at the prosecutor. "Your position, Ms. Reese?" The state believes Mr. Chen's actions constitute a serious breach of trust and a deliberate exploitation of his father's age and living situation. While we're open to the plea agreement, we ask that restitution be prioritized and that probation terms include mandatory financial counseling and a prohibition on serving as power of attorney or account holder for any elderly person. The judge nodded, then looked at James. Mr. Chen, do you understand the charges against you? Yes, Your Honor, James said quietly. And you wish to accept this plea agreement? Yes, Your Honor. Do you have anything you'd like to say before I make my decision? James hesitated. Then he turned finally and looked at Robert. His eyes were red, his face drawn. Dad, I'm sorry. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. I was desperate, and I made terrible choices, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it right. Robert looked at his son and felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not even disappointment. Just a kind of empty recognition that the person he had raised no longer existed, if he ever had. The judge spoke. Mr. Chen, I'm accepting the plea agreement with modifications. You will pay full restitution of $62,000 to your father over a period of 8 years, not 10. You will serve 5 years probation with mandatory financial counseling, and you are prohibited from managing finances for any elderly or vulnerable person for the remainder of your life. Do you accept these terms? Yes, Your Honor, James said. Then this court is adjourned. It was over in less than 20 minutes. James left through a side door with his attorney. Linda stood and turned to Robert. Are you happy now? No, Robert said, but I'm not invisible either. Linda left without another word. Robert sat in the empty courtroom for a few minutes, listening to the silence. Then he stood, buttoned his coat, and walked out into December cold that smelled like snow and car exhaust. Janet Reese was waiting in the hallway. Mr. Chen, I wanted to thank you. A lot of people in your position don't come forward. They're too ashamed or too afraid of what it'll do to their families. You did the right thing. Didn't feel right, Robert said. It rarely does, Janet said, but that doesn't make it less necessary. Robert took a cab back to Veterans Hope. The sun was setting as they drove, that same amber light he watched from his window every evening. The driver tried to make conversation, asking about his day, but Robert just said it was fine and stared out the window. Back in his room, Robert sat in his chair and looked at the space where the apple bowl had been. The nurse had taken it away, replaced it with nothing. The dresser looked bare now, empty except for Margaret's photo and his reading glasses. Over the next few months, things settled into a new kind of normal. James didn't visit. Linda called once in January, a brief, awkward conversation that ended with her saying she needed time. Robert told her he understood. David sent an email, something vague about hoping things would get better. Robert didn't respond, but other things filled the space. Robert started eating in the common room more often, sitting with Harold and Dennis and Frank. They formed a kind of informal club, 4 veterans who understood each other in ways their families never had. They played cards on Wednesday nights. They watched war documentaries and argued about details. They existed together in a comfortable silence that felt like its own kind of family. Richard Masterson visited twice, bringing paperwork for a new account. This one with no joint holders, no access for anyone but Robert. I'm also setting up a trust, Richard said. When you're gone, whatever's left goes to a veteran's scholarship fund, not to your kids. Good, Robert said. In March, the first restitution check arrived. $775, exactly 1/96th of what had been taken, spread over 8 years. Robert deposited it and didn't think about it again. Spring came slowly. The hedges outside his window bloomed with small yellow flowers, and maintenance workers planted new grass in the bare patches on the lawn. Robert watched it all from his chair, the way he watched everything, present and aware. One afternoon in April, there was a knock on his door. Robert opened it to find a man he didn't recognize, maybe 35, wearing business casual and holding a notebook. Mr. Chen, my name is David Park. I'm a reporter with the county newspaper. I heard about your case and I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk about it. Robert hesitated. Why? Because elder financial abuse is more common than people realize, and most victims don't come forward. Your story could help others. Robert thought about that, about other old men and women sitting in rooms like his, being stolen from, being dismissed, being called senile by people who were supposed to love them. "All right," Robert said. "Come in." They talked for an hour. David asked questions, took notes, recorded parts of the conversation with Robert's permission. He asked about Korea, about Margaret, about James. He asked what it felt like to turn in your own son. "It felt like I was remembering who I was," Robert said. The article ran 2 weeks later, front page of the local section. Veteran takes stand against elder abuse, how one man's fight exposed a silent epidemic. The photo showed Robert in his chair by the window, his veteran's pin visible on his collar, his face calm and dignified. After the article, things changed again. People recognized him. Other residents at Veterans Hope stopped him in hallways to say thank you, to share their own stories of children who'd stolen or neglected them. A lawyer called, asking if he'd be willing to speak to a senior advocacy group. Robert said yes. In June, Robert stood in front of 40 people at the community center, veterans and seniors and family members, and he told his story. Not for sympathy, not for applause, just to say it out loud, to make it real, to prove that being old didn't mean being powerless. "I served my country," Robert said, standing at a podium that felt both too tall and too heavy. "I raised my family. I did everything I was supposed to do, and then my son thought I was too senile to notice he was stealing from me. But I noticed, and I did something about it, not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted my dignity back." The room was silent when he finished. Then someone started clapping. Then another person. Then everyone. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just steady, respectful applause that said, "We see you." That summer, Robert turned 82. No one brought him cake. No one called except David, the reporter, checking in. But Harold and Dennis and Frank took him to the VFW post for dinner, and they raised glasses of soda and coffee because none of them drank anymore, and they toasted to another year of stubbornness. "To Robert," Frank said, "who reminded us that being old doesn't mean being done." In September, the final restitution check arrived. 8 years' worth of payments, completed ahead of schedule because James's attorney had negotiated a settlement. The account was whole again. $62,000 plus interest. It sat in the bank, protected and untouchable. A number on a screen that meant Robert Chen had been heard. He sat in his chair by the window that evening, watching the amber light turn orange, then red, then fade. The maintenance worker was trimming hedges again, the sound of electric shears buzzing like angry wasps. Normal sounds, everyday sounds, the sounds of a world that kept turning. Robert thought about James sometimes, about whether he was working, whether he was sorry, whether he understood. But mostly Robert thought about himself, about the man who'd come back from Korea and built a life, about the man who'd been married for 43 years, about the man who'd let himself become invisible because it seemed easier than fighting. That man was gone. In his place was someone who knew his worth, who demanded to be seen, who understood that respect wasn't given freely. It had to be earned, and sometimes it had to be taken back. Robert Chen was 82 years old. He lived in room 14 at Veterans Hope Residence. He had white hair and shaking hands and a hip that ached when it rained. But when staff walked past his door now, they didn't see a room number. They saw a veteran. They saw a man. They saw Robert Chen, who refused to be forgotten, who stood up when it mattered, who proved that being old didn't mean being powerless. The sun set outside his window, the same as it did every evening, painting the world in shades of amber and orange. Robert watched it all, present and aware, a quiet witness to his own life. He was still here, and he still mattered. That was enough.